Far-right figures have discovered something new to create fertiliser in their trousers about.
This is insane. Speakers at the World Economic Forum says that farming and fishing is, quote, ecocide. They want it to be a, quote, serious crime. Share if you stand with the farmers. I guess we're all just supposed to starve, but it doesn't seem like she's missed too many meals. Oh, come on. Ugh, I'm not going to do the voice. I can't do the voice. So I'm not going to do it. Ecocide. That's what working class people will be charged with doing while they're trying to live, and the elites are trying to sacrifice them to the always bloodthirsty... blood... emoji?
Ecocide. Ecocide, a terrifying new concept for the far right that will apparently lead to the global woke elite sacrificing the blood of the working classes. And it probably makes you gay too. But why have these people suddenly become so terrified of this concept? What makes it relevant now? In this video we're going to talk about the genesis of the term ecocide during the Vietnam War, its connections to resource extraction and colonialism, and look at the case of Palestine to show how ecocide, genocide and settler colonialism intersect to create the horrors that we've been seeing all over our screens. So to take some advice my PhD supervisor gave to the eminent frog Dr. Jordan B. Peterson,
probably worth learning about the concepts and the suggested international criminal definitions before spouting such absolute nonsense. That is my Damien impression, which is gonna hit for maybe one viewer.
During the Vietnam War, the US military, in conjunction with corporations like Monsanto, invented a new method of waging devastating warfare, the horrendous impact of which are still being felt to this day, over 50 years later. Agent Orange was a chemical compound which was sprayed over vast swathes of Vietnamese land and devastated an estimated 5 million acres of forests, with the stated aim to expose the South Vietnamese guerrilla fighters, the Viet Cong. Now, the Viet Cong used the forests of Vietnam to hide in and wage effective warfare against the invading Imperial US Army. In response to the failure of the US military to defeat this less powerful local resistance, which, you know, fucking nailed it, lads. That is the Viet Cong. Is it bad to call the Viet Cong lads? Maybe. In response to being unable to defeat the Viet Cong, President Lyndon B. Johnson radically expanded the use of Agent Orange. The result was not just the elimination of certain plants, but the complete destruction of entire environments upon which Vietnamese people depend to live. But more than just the decimation of environments, Agent Orange has been linked to mass death and disability. Around 4.8 million people were sprayed with Agent Orange, and an estimated 400,000 died due to exposure, and according to the Vietnamese Red Cross, a further 1 million people were disabled or suffered extreme health issues. To this day, babies are being born in Vietnam with congenital disorders which have been linked to the continued presence of Agent Orange in the environment. This devastation of environmental and human life was cited during the 1970 conference, War Crimes and the American Conscience. Which must have been a big conference. Well, I mean, I guess the US conscience is quite small, but the war crimes are big? Maybe it was a medium-sized conference. In this War Crimes conference, which is a cursed phrase that I'm going to repeat. In this War Crimes conference, America's many crimes in Vietnam were surveyed, and during it, the term ecocide was first used. This was the beginning of a long and winding road in the journey to codify ecocide as a crime under international law. The differing perspectives on how ecocide should be understood and how it should be defined under the law reflect differing perspectives on environmental destruction, on the relationship between humans and nature, and on genocide more broadly. So, for example, some at the War Crimes Conference, still cursed, such as Arthur Galston or Richard Falk, argued for a legal view of ecocide with a clear link to existing war crimes and deliberate herbicidal warfare. It was like discrete, these are lists of things which are ecocidal because they're tied to war crimes. So it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate in Galston's or Falk's view to describe environmentally destructive resource extraction as ecocide. And this kind of mirrors the international legal understanding of genocide, with its associate role of intent. Some people argue direct intent is essential, and other, more correct people like me, basically understand genocide more holistically as a broader process of social death. More recently, Scottish international lawyer Polly Higgins, among others, has drawn on such holistic views of ecocide in spearheading attempts to codify it under international law. Higgins labels ecocide the missing fifth crime against peace. This is in reference to the 4 existing crimes under the Rome Statute: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. The big 4. All the lads. Higgins and our collaborators, including Damien Short, who suggested I do this video, argue that an international legal duty to prevent ecocide would help prevent catastrophic impacts of global warming and force states to accept responsibility for environmental destruction. Higgins and Damien emphasise with their view of ecocide not Galston's understanding of it as a method of warfare, a list of ecocidal acts to be criminalised, nor the idea that ecocide is a genocide conducted by a separate humanity onto an environment. Rather, according to Higgins' proposed amendment to the Rome Statute, ecocide is the extensive damage to, destruction of, or loss of ecosystems of a given territory, whether by human agency or by other causes, to such an extent that peaceful enjoyment by the inhabitants of that territory has been severely diminished. Included in this view is that ecocide can occur by both intentional destruction of environments in warfare, as well as through other means, which, of course, would include here resource extraction or impacts of global warming. So moreover, this environmental destruction is tied to the inability of the people of that land to live peacefully on it. So it doesn't fall into that environmentalist trap of viewing ecocide as something a separate humanity does to the environment, but connects humans innately to the world in which we live. In this sense, Higgins presents a more of a general formula of ecocide, rather than a discrete list of crimes. To take it down from the sort of abstracted level of international law for a second, there have also been a number of campaigns across the world to create national level crimes and regulations to criminalise ecocide. In the UK, for example, there are a number of bills being pushed by groups like the Stop Ecocide Foundation and Stop Rosebank campaign, one of which is making its way through the Scottish Parliament right now, and the other one currently in the House of Lords. And one potential sort of benefit to these national level legislations and compared to international law is they're not bound by the same standards as international criminal constructions. And by that I mean that this national regulation, these national laws, can actually target corporations as entities for liability for conducting ecocides, rather than just CEOs or just individuals within those corporations. And this is understood as like a major benefit of pursuing this ecocide through national level regulation rather than international law. And this is not to say either national legislation or international law or a combination of both is necessarily a way to solve ecocide. If you're familiar with my channel at all, you know I don't really think anything's as simple as that, except communist revolution. Rather, what I wanted to do here was give you a sense of the development of the term ecocide and the groups currently mobilising around it. From its formations as a result of the devastation wrought by Agent Orange to more recent attempts to codify it under international law, ecocide has been understood in a number of ways, and each has faced its own challenges, like establishing legal intent or disagreements over binding corporations under an international legal duty, or general criticisms of anthropocentrism within legal documents. Regardless, the development of the concept of ecocide from the original formulation, originally proposed in response to Agent Orange, is a developing idea, whether that's legally or sociologically. And so in the next section, we're going to go beyond legal views of ecocide and talk about how capitalism and colonialism are innately ecocidal. There is an innate drive within capitalism to expand, grow, and accumulate more and more profit, more capital. Under capitalism, the production of commodities for sale to realise profits became generalised across society and altered all socio-economic relations. Which is why, for Marx, the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. This generalised capitalist commodity production becomes, through ceaseless competition and the need to grow, an unending treadmill of production. This underlying logic and need for growth overwhelms alternative ways of organising the social world and has led to what has been called capitalism's metabolic rift, whereby the intimate relationship between humanity and nature is pushed apart by the overwhelming logic for capital accumulation. This rift has had devastating effects on the environment over the centuries, and Marx, for example, was hugely concerned with the devastating effects on the land that was caused by capitalist agriculture. Agricultural production for the capitalist market bears no relationship in its social and ecological consequences to subsistence agriculture or farming to supply local markets. The purpose is different, it is volatile, subject to global market fluctuations, and there is an insatiable quality to it. As long as there is money to make, or, because of the role of finance and taxes in agriculture, there are debts to pay. As a consequence, fields are planted when they should rest, and herds are expanded when they should be culled, leading to the rapid degradation of the land. But beyond just agriculture, the logic of accumulation has obviously been devastating to the world in a number of other ways, with fossil fuel extraction, mining, and, global warming. So, the logic of capital has deleterious effects on the environment. But does that mean it's ecocidal? In their examination of this question, Damien Short and Martin Crook, whom I apologise to unreservedly for calling scatterbrained while 2/3 of a bottle of wine deep during a stream.
I just randomly clicked on I think it's 58 minutes or something. And you started talking about the upgrade Fiverr and described me as a scatterbrain. I was like, of all the places for me to jump on, 3 hours, and somehow I managed to catch that part. I have to admit, that made me laugh.
Sorry. That's professionalism. That's academic professionalism. They argue that not only does the constant imperative to produce and extract resources in ever more extreme ways cause obscene damage to the environment, including being the drive which is pushing devastating global warming, but that the destructive impact of extractivism has had a specifically genocidal impact on indigenous peoples across the world. Thus, Crook and Short emphasise both the destruction of nature as a part of ecocide alongside the view of humanity as an essential part of the environment. To make their argument, Damien and Martin, we're going to call them by their first names now, we're all friends now. I've just drawn them into some friendships. Damien, Martin, you now have 42,000 new friends. To make their argument, Damien and Martin draw on Lemkin's original understanding of genocide as not just the intentional destruction of a people through death, but the destruction of a people's distinct culture. For indigenous peoples worldwide, the logic of elimination that informed frontier massacres in places like Australia and North America, and the assimilationist agendas that followed, now underpin expansionist land grabs driven by the logic of global capitalism. In numerous colonial contexts in the years after 1945, the traditional forms of colonial terror transformed into a genocide machine as the nature of capitalist domination became less overtly racist and more attuned to corporate imperatives. Nowadays, governments frequently dispossess indigenous groups through industrial mining and farming and also through military operations and national park schemes, all of which routinely take no account of core indigenous rights. So in, for example, northern Alberta, the Canadian government alongside oil corporations have been invading indigenous sovereignty to extract oil from tar sand areas. This has resulted in not only a destruction of indigenous lands, but has had horrendous impacts on indigenous people's health in the area, with pollution having been linked to high levels of leukemia, lymphoma and colon cancer. But essentially, This destruction of land has been described by First Nations people of the area, such as George Poitras, as genocidal destruction of their culture. If we don't have land and we don't have anywhere to carry out our traditional lifestyle, we lose who we are as people. So if there's no land, then it's equivalent in our estimation to genocide of a people. Genocide, as I've spoken about in other videos quite extensively, is not just about the mass killing of a group, but in the words of the inventor of the term Rabatel-Lemkin, genocide has two phases. One, destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. The other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. This imposition in turn may be made upon the oppressed population, which is allowed to remain, or upon the territory alone after removal of the population and the colonisation of the area by the oppressor's own nationals. So with the colonial and capitalist drive to ever expand resource extraction for profit, indigenous peoples and cultures are destroyed, along with their cultural specific patterns of relating to the land. Instead, an overwhelming logic of capitalist expansion is imposed upon the territory, and the metabolic rift of capitalism is pushed ever wider. And this is not some new dynamic. Early in the colonial era, liberal philosopher and man who's apparently just smelled dog shit, John Locke, argued that ownership over the land could only be claimed if it was made productive. Thus, the dispossession of the native populations of Turtle Island, or colonial North America, was just. It was all good by dog shit smeller Locke. And there is a very clear logical through line from Locke to the Alberta tar sands, the destruction of a colonised group's cultural existence through the theft of land and the imposition of destructive, extractive capitalist relations. Ecocide as genocide. And this is not to say that extraction doesn't kill. Companies engaged in extractive capitalist development have a long and sordid history of murder. Chevron Texaco has been accused of wiping out entire tribes as part of their ecologically devastating oil extraction process in the Amazon, while the Canadian oil company Talisman was accused of attempted genocide by the Peruvian government. These corporate responsibilities are part of why people want to push corporate liability for ecocide, things like this. But what I wanted to emphasise here is that when we're talking about ecocide, we aren't just speaking about deliberate acts of herbicidal warfare, nor are we just talking about a genocide committed against the environment. Rather, we link ecocide to both processes innate to capital accumulation and to an understanding of genocide grounded in Lemkin's original definition, which highlights colonisation as innately genocidal. Ecocide then encompasses environmental degradation, conditions which bring about the death of a specific group, and the destruction of the cultures of colonised people alongside the imposition of the pattern of the colonisers and their relation to the land, whether that's raw capitalist logic or a slightly different dynamic. And so, over the past 500 years, the capitalist metabolic rift has been exported across the world through colonialism and imperialism to devastating ecocidal effects. And it is these effects inherent to capitalism that make ecocide so terrifying to the fun guys like Jordan Peterson and Trump the Lesser. They don't want to hear that their entire social system is genocidal, is ecocidal, and is innately destructive. They just want to keep making profit. Or being like high priests of making profit. I don't think Jordan Peterson wants to make profit, really. I think he kind of wants to be a pseudo-religious figure of profit making. That makes him sound way cooler than he actually is. So I can't talk about ecocide without talking about perhaps the most violent expression of ecocide and genocide that is horrifyingly unfolding right now in Palestine. Despite the classic settler colonial idea that Zionist settlers found in Palestine an arid wasteland, a terra nullius, a desert that settlers would apparently make bloom, Palestine is a prime example of ecocide because the violence, environmental devastation and settler colonial logic at play means that it spans across basically every view of ecocide that we've spoken about today. Let's begin though in relating it back to Vietnam with the environmental destruction in service to waging war, or more accurately, conducting genocide. So reading I.O. Weissman's introduction to Molave's examination of the environmental devastation wrought on Gaza by the Israeli state, written before the genocidal devastation conducted by Israel since October 2023, it is impossible not to think of America's use of Agent Orange in Vietnam. The desertification of the perimeter of Gaza is part of the mechanism of its control. Israel routinely sends its bulldozers over the fence to uproot crops and destroy plantation and greenhouses. Israel continuously expanded the military no-go area or buffer zone. Its use of aerial crop dusters to spray a toxic plant-killing herbicide mobilised the wind to carry toxic clouds into Gazan territory, destroying agricultural lands hundreds of metres away. Bulldozers on the land and toxic clouds in the air transformed a once lush and agriculturally active border zone into parched ground, cleared of vegetation, a colonial-made desert. The spraying of herbicides, which have been identified as a carcinogen by the World Health Organization, across the buffer zones between the occupied Palestinian territories of Israel and the open-air prison of Gaza, cannot but invoke the use of Agent Orange in Vietnam. Remember that the formal justification for the use of Agent Orange was to ensure the Viet Cong had no place to hide. In Gaza, the destruction of farmland, the flattening and desertification of the buffer zones give the Israeli military clear, uninterrupted lines of sight with which to murder Palestinians.
Over the years, Palestinian farmers along Gaza's fortified perimeter have faced airborne spraying of herbicides. Regular bulldozing of their crops. And sniper fire by the Israeli occupation forces.
Molave points out that Palestinian farmers living and working along the border are prohibited by Israeli military from growing crops over 1 metre, meaning that the cultivation of any trees in these areas is routinely destroyed, with farmers forced to transition and plant low-growing crops. This flattening of the land prevents Palestinian fighters from mobilising, but it also gave the Israeli occupation forces clear lines of sight to indiscriminately open fire on the peaceful demonstrators during the Palestinian Great March of Return in 2018. I know there's quite a clear consistency in the logic of using herbicidal warfare between American imperialism in Vietnam and Israeli settler colonialism in Palestine. Like in Vietnam, this herbicidal warfare has devastated the ability of besieged Palestinians to grow enough food to survive.
The systemic destruction of larger ecologies is known as ecocide. In the case of this campaign, it joins Israel's genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. These greenhouses and farmlands are fundamental to local food production, and their systemic destruction has supported the ongoing catastrophic and human-made famine in Gaza.
We can compare this with the case laid out by international lawyer Richard Falk during the Vietnam War Crimes Conference, where he said that the United States stood guilty of war crimes in Vietnam that amounted to genocide. But why ecocide? For Falk, the strategy of environmental destruction for military purposes represented the demonic logic of counterinsurgency warfare, a logic that proceeded on the basic rationale of separating the people from their land. Paraphrasing Mao's famous likening of guerrillas to fish swimming in the sea of peasants, Falk characterised counterinsurgency doctrine as an attempt to dry up the sea of civilians. This drying up process is translated militarily into making the countryside unfit for civilian habitation. Long before October 2023, Israel had embarked on a process of making civilian life uninhabitable for Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. The profound, repulsive irony of the Zionist call to make the desert bloom is that where once there was lush farmland supporting a thriving people, Israel has created a desert. And this has obviously only gotten worse since October. As research by Goldsmiths University has demonstrated, Israel has been systematically targeting agricultural land in Gaza since October 7th, destroying 40% of farmland, and at least a third of Gaza's greenhouses, which has, of course, contributed to the famine imposed by Israel on the Gaza population.
Prior to 2023, Gaza contained 170 square kilometers of agricultural land, accounting for about 47% of its total area. These fields and orchards served as a local source of food security for besieged Palestinians. Satellite image analysis reveals that nearly 50% of Palestinian farms and orchards in Gaza have been targeted by Israel's ground invasion.
In Palestine, environments are destroyed, farmland is destroyed, a desert has been created in service to the colonial military conquest of the land by Israel. When considered alongside Polly Higgins' proposed amendment to the Rome Statute, it is inescapably clear that Israel has created immense environmental devastation to such an extent that peaceful enjoyment by the inhabitants of that territory has been severely diminished. Though, of course, such legal language seems inadequate. Instead, I would just say it's clear that Israel is committing ecocide.
The destroyed agricultural land may also indicate that the Israeli army is expanding its buffer zone along the Gaza's perimeter, further shrinking the livable space for Palestinians.
But the genocide and the ecocide in Palestine is not only comparable to the warfare waged against Vietnam. Like indigenous peoples in North America, Palestinians are subject to a colonialist extractive form of ecocide, which attempts to destroy indigenous ties to the land, to nature, and to the environment, ways which are part of the cultural reproduction of those groups, and then impose colonial modes of relating to the land atop the indigenous Palestinian ways of life. As Wiseman notes, seen from the point of view of colonial history, climate transformation is not the accidental and indirect consequence of conflict. The environment is not the collateral damage of history, but a tool in its arsenal of transformation, a form of government over land, peoples, and the relation between them. The environment is one of the means by which colonial racism is enacted, land is grabbed, siege lines fortified, and violence perpetuated. The notion that Palestine was an empty, arid desert ready to be made bloom by Zionist settlers is a settler colonial myth, with a direct lineage to dogshit smeller John Locke's justification for dispossessing indigenous nations in North America. And as I've mentioned, Palestine was never just a desert, but a rich, diverse region with a wealth of fertile land. And this is one of the features that made it so attractive to colonial and imperial forces over the years. But Israel persists with its colonial myth-making. Just look at this video posted by Israel's official Twitter account on March 22nd of this year, over 5 months into Israel's latest genocidal military venture.
Here's how Israel went from this to this in just 75 years. Israel, which is 60% desert, used to face serious water shortages. But thanks to innovative solutions like advanced filtration and drip irrigation, today Israel is a global water powerhouse. Israel is ranked number 1 worldwide in water recycling, reusing 86% of its water. Israel shares its water technologies and solutions with countries around the world, including India, Brazil, the United States, and Jordan. We are proud to use our expertise in water to create a safer, greener, more sustainable future for all.
And their systemic destruction has supported the ongoing catastrophic and human-made famine in Gaza.
We can see the perpetuation of the myth of making the desert bloom alongside idealized images of techno-utopian solutions which have supposedly made this land productive. It's all bound up in a classic capitalist colonial ideology where the land's proper stewards are those with the smarts to gain mastery over it. Again though, there is a horrible irony in this mythology. That is, as Israel has expanded over Palestinian land, as settlers have displaced more and more indigenous Palestinians, it has absolutely devastated water supplies. It's crashed biodiversity and actually produced desertification. Separate from the military desertification around Gaza, agricultural desertification. Rosina Hassoun sums up this position as a cycle of environmental destruction which takes place each time an Israeli settlement is built. Typically, the cycle begins when land is confiscated from Arab inhabitants, the land is cleared and some soil erosion begins. The construction of houses, roads, parking lots and sidewalks prevents the reabsorption of rainwater into the aquifers below, and the runoff is polluted with petroleum and other chemical consequences of modern settlement, wherever it occurs. Early in the process of building the settlements, modern drilling equipment is brought in and a deep well is created to supply the new settlement with water. This lowers the water table, diminishing the water quality and the quality for surrounding Arab populations. So this extractive theft of water from Palestinians is a function of settler colonial ecocide. Farmers who have lived on the land for generations see that land as parched, see the soil dry and degrade, or often just have their lands bulldozed and forced to leave.
Israel controls the two main aquifers in the occupied Palestinian territories, underground bodies of rock which hold large deposits of water. Israel takes around 87% of this water for its own citizens. Israel controls the collection of rainwater throughout most of the West Bank. Palestinians are prevented from drilling new water wells, installing pumps, or deepening existing wells. Rainwater harvesting systems owned by Palestinian communities are routinely destroyed by the Israeli army, as are other water infrastructure and facilities. In contrast, Israelis living on illegal settlements in the West Bank enjoy an ample water supply, allowing vineyards, olive groves, farms and date plantations to thrive.
Here's how Israel went from this to this in just 75 years.
The colonial ecocide, from draining the Hulla swamps which displaced Arab inhabitants who had lived off the land for centuries, to farmers in the West Bank, to those besieged in Gaza, is erasing the ability of Palestinians to maintain the historical, cultural relationship to the land. In Lemkinian terms, the colonial ecocide is disrupting Palestinian genos, their ability to exist in relation to the land which has been part of their cultural existence for centuries. A desert has been created in service to a colonial bloom. I want to make a final example to illustrate the ecocidal settler colonial dimensions of Israeli occupation of Palestine. I could speak about the devastation of agricultural land in Gaza, which is now being eyed up to commodify and sell as beachfront property in a ghoulish display of colonial value extraction. Or I could talk about the sale of oil fields, the extraction of oil in Palestinian waters. All for commodities, all for extraction, all for value. But instead, I want to talk about Palestinian orange and olive groves. Since Zionism began murdering and displacing Palestinians, olive and orange groves have become a sign of Palestinian identity and resistance. They've been a staple crop grown by Palestinians across the whole region for centuries. One good example, one kind of colonial example, corporatist example, is Jaffa cakes. Jaffa cakes are named after the orange grown in Jaffa. Jaffa, a Palestinian city which has been subsumed and overtaken by Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is built atop Jaffa. And Jaffa cakes, obviously, they were made in 1927, because the oranges of Jaffa, of Palestine, were such a massive thing. They were so culturally known. But more than just being a method of agriculture, they also became a method of facilitating communal links between communities within Palestine. In this sense, citriculture was exactly that. A culture that formed social behaviours, norms and customs with a major economic and social role in the lives of the Arabs living under the Ottoman Empire and later British mandate in Palestine. That is, citriculture was a constituent part of Palestinian genos. Its erasure would mean an erasure of a part of Palestinian cultural life, an attempt to destroy Palestinians as people. Yet, of course, since Zionist settler colonialism began, this citriculture has been decimated. From 1901 onwards, the Jewish National Fund began planting 240 million non-indigenous pine trees across Palestinian landscape. These trees were deliberately chosen to Europeanize the Palestinian landscape, but are a massive drain on water. And as anyone will tell you of monoculture pine forests, they have a whole host of deleterious impacts on the environment. But with these trees came the story of declining water supplies, of which citriculture requires plenty of supply, water supply which was increasingly stolen from indigenous Palestinians, and this made the maintenance of the industry basically impossible. It was impossible to sustain the citriculture because of this theft of water, this planting of trees and this crowding out of space. Alongside, simply bulldozing and destroying farms, Palestinian citriculture was steadily destroyed, and along with it, so too was that aspect of Palestinian genos. As of last year, there was only one remaining warehouse in Gaza, standing as a monument to historic citriculture, the Al-Shawa Citrus and Vegetable Packing House in northeast Gaza, though it seems likely that even this has been erased by genocidal Israeli bombardment. A horrifying example of the confluence of long trends of settler colonial erasure and its sudden bouts of extreme violence. And in a final insult to indigenous Palestinians, and consistent with the myth of making the desert bloom, Israel has attempted to co-opt citriculture and olive trees as a national symbol for itself. When Palestinian farmers no longer had the space or the water to grow either, Israel stepped in with large farms and stolen water to fill the gap. It's now Israel that exports citrus for profit. This final stage of Israel's ecocidal genocide is to co-opt the symbols of Palestinian genos, an attempt to erase the memory of the people on whose stolen land they live. From the herbicidal warfare in Vietnam, to the extreme energy extraction in the Alberta tar sands, to the confluence of herbicidal warfare and settler colonial extraction in occupied Palestine, Ecocide has reared its hydra-like heads, each with a slightly different face, but all fundamentally the same beast. All are expressions of imperial, colonial, capitalist logic, where that logic requires pushing back the threat of communism in Vietnam, no matter how many people need to be murdered or environments need to be destroyed, or whether it requires the ever-expanding resource extraction to keep the capitalist machine churning, or whether it requires a sub-imperial settler colonial ally in a threatening region. The web of capitalist social totality cannot be reformed not to engender ecocide. It's a function of its existence. And nowhere is that clearer than in the mass ecocidal events appearing more and more regularly across the world, as fossil capital-induced global warming devastates more and more environments and erodes the ability of people across the world to reproduce their cultural lives. Ecocide is not a genocide that we commit against the environment. It is an environmental feature of genocide.
Alright, thank you for watching. We have once again entered the realm of the depressing. We did one chicken run video, and that's all the fun you're getting this year. We're back in the depressing zone. I hope that this was an informative video. I'm very pleased with it. Please, if you can, sign up to my Patreon or give a one-off tip via PayPal or Ko-fi. I'd appreciate it so much while I'm in my job hunting zone, which is great fun. Patrons $10 and above get their names read out in the credits, so I will just do that for them right now. Demo Squid, Dying of Thirst, Soval Hayes, Jonathan Petrie, Earl Grey Tea, Bonnie, Katie Marshall, Nina G Public Relations, FD Signifier, Lizzie G, Quint Wolf, Kim Crawley, Anita Anispi, Ellis Wren, Sophie, Hey Joe, Cameron Blakemore, Misling, Cyril Smid, Rachel Ann, Melanie Estes, Leum, Xander Corvus, Fia Westphal, Jack, TB Skyen, Christopher Poff, Morgussie, Daniel Cusid, Joshua Moldenhauer, Tom Price, Cade Soiree, Esoteric Fictionalism, Austin Talman, Robin, Rachel Mixon, Michelle H, Rich, Duncan Skinner, Niels Abelgard, Tinfoil Pancakes, Kieran Gore, Aga Ghost, Banya Carroll, Joel, Daniel Hughes, Nelly Zacheva, J. Fraser Cartwright, Aaron, Tamash Kisbetter, and Paul Singleton. You're all beautiful people, and I love you so much. And yeah, thanks again for watching. Like I say, please like and share, subscribe, and all that jazz. And if you can, sign up to my Patreon. And I hope you're all not feeling too sad. Love you. Bye.